On the morning of September 15, 1945, Nurse Lieutenant Yamamoto Ko stood on the deck of a United States Navy transport, her hands gripping the cold metal railing as the California coastline emerged through the Pacific mist like an impossible dream. 3 weeks earlier, she had been tending wounded soldiers in a field hospital on Okinawa, convinced she would die defending her homeland. Now, one of roughly 70 Japanese military nurses captured during the final bloody months of the Pacific War. She was about to see something that would fundamentally challenge everything she had been taught about the enemy. The women huddled together on deck, their tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniforms hanging loose on frames thinned by months of wartime deprivation. They had expected execution, torture, or at minimum, brutal imprisonment. Instead, American sailors had given them blankets, medical care, and surprisingly decent food during the ocean crossing. Lieutenant Yamamoto exchanged nervous glances with her fellow prisoners. None dared speak, the questions burning in their minds. What fate awaited them in this foreign land? As the ship approached San Francisco Harbor, a collective gasp rippled through the prisoners. The Golden Gate Bridge rose before them, its massive orange towers piercing the morning sky. A feat of engineering that seemed to defy gravity. Yamamoto, who had studied in Tokyo before the war, considered herself familiar with modern infrastructure, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the sheer scale of American construction. According to a September 1945 article in the San Francisco Chronicle, Japanese prisoners arriving at West Coast ports consistently expressed shock at American infrastructure. Military translators reported that many initially refused to believe the bridge was real, assuming it must be an elaborate stage set designed to intimidate them. The harbor itself presented an even more overwhelming spectacle. Dozens of ships lined the docks. Massive cargo vessels were loaded and unloaded with mechanical efficiency that made Yamamoto's head spin. Cranes capable of lifting entire boxcars swung cargo through the air, operated by workers who seemed to command these metal giants with casual expertise. In the shipyards across the bay, she could see at least 6 vessels in various stages of construction, their skeletal frames rising against the skyline like the ribs of steel, leviathans. Petty Officer Tanaka Mo, a naval communications specialist captured on Saipan, stood beside Yamamoto and whispered in barely audible Japanese, "How is this possible?" They had been told America was weak, its industry crippled by luxury and depression. The reality before them told a radically different story. This was an industrial colossus operating at levels Japan could not match. The prisoners were transported by truck convoy through San Francisco, and what Yamamoto witnessed during that journey further shattered her understanding of modern warfare's foundations. The streets teemed with automobiles, private cars driven by ordinary civilians. In Tokyo, even before the devastating American bombing campaign, private car ownership had been rare and limited to the wealthy and officials. Here, traffic jams formed from the sheer number of personal vehicles, a sight so absurd that several of the Japanese women laughed nervously, certain they were being driven through a special demonstration area. Buildings rose higher than any structures Yamamoto had seen outside central Tokyo. Department stores with massive glass windows displayed consumer goods in quantities that seemed fantastical. Clothing, furniture, appliances, toys, all apparently available to anyone with money. Electric signs advertise everything from Coca-Cola to movies, their bright colors almost painful to eyes accustomed to wartime blackouts and scarcity. Young women walked the streets in fashionable dresses and high heels, carrying shopping bags and seemingly unconcerned with the war that had just ended. What struck Yamamoto most forcefully was the absence of visible war damage. She had left a Japan where every major city bore the scars of American bombing. Tokyo, essentially destroyed by incendiary raids, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, obliterated. Yet here, thousands of miles away in the nation that had unleashed such destruction, life appeared utterly normal. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. Their destination was a processing facility outside Sacramento, where the prisoners would undergo medical examinations and interrogation before assignment to a P camp. During the 2-hour drive through California's Central Valley, Yamamoto observed agricultural operations that further expanded her understanding of American capacity. Massive farms stretched to the horizon, worked by mechanical harvesters that did the work of dozens of manual laborers. Irrigation systems channeled water across thousands of acres with engineering precision. Storage silos rose above the landscape like monuments to abundance. Corporal Sato Fumiko, a radio operator captured in the Philippines, broke the silence. "My brother wrote to me in 1943. He was serving on Guadalcanal. He said American soldiers threw away cans of food that still had meat in them. I thought he was exaggerating to make a point about wastefulness. Now I wonder if he was simply reporting what he saw." The other women nodded slowly. They had all heard similar stories and dismissed them as impossible exaggerations or propaganda. Japanese soldiers had often fought with dwindling supplies and gone hungry for days. Yamamoto had treated patients suffering from malnutrition and deficiency diseases. The idea that any army could be so well supplied that soldiers might waste food had seemed like obvious fiction. A War Department prisoner of war division report, cited in historian Arnold Kramer's 1979 book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, noted that Japanese prisoners consistently displayed extreme shock at American material abundance, with many requiring psychological counseling to reconcile their observations with wartime propaganda. The report specifically mentioned female prisoners as particularly articulate in expressing disillusionment. As the truck passed through a small town, Yamamoto noticed ordinary houses with manicured lawns, automobiles parked in driveways, and children playing with toys and bicycles. An ice cream truck played cheerful music as it traveled down a residential street. The normalcy was almost offensive to someone who had spent years in a nation mobilized for total war. The Sacramento processing facility proved another revelation in institutional capacity. The compound had been constructed specifically to handle the influx of prisoners from the Pacific Theater, and its scale demonstrated the same casual approach to resource deployment Yamamoto had observed since landing. Long, clean barracks stood in neat rows. Administrative offices used electric typewriters and filing systems. A medical clinic was equipped with instruments and supplies that would have been considered luxurious in a Japanese military hospital even before shortages became critical. A female American Army officer, Captain Sarah Morrison, of the Women's Army Corps, addressed the Japanese prisoners through an interpreter. She spoke in clear, measured tones that the interpreter rendered into formal Japanese. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and housing. You will not be tortured or abused. Those are the rules, and we follow them. Several of the Japanese women wept quietly, overcome by exhaustion, confusion, and the dawning realization that they had survived. Yamamoto found herself unable to cry. Her emotions were frozen in a kind of shocked suspension. She had prepared for death and written farewell letters to her family before the invasion of Japan. This strange anticlimax captured transportation, and now apparent imprisonment under reasonable conditions felt more surreal than any nightmare she had imagined. The medical examination that followed reinforced Yamamoto's growing understanding of the gulf between American and Japanese military capabilities. The clinic had X-ray machines, proper surgical suites, stocks of penicillin and sulfa drugs, bandages, antiseptics, and pain medications in quantities that would have served a major Tokyo hospital for months. American medical officers treated the Japanese prisoners with professional detachment, neither cruel nor particularly warm. Simply competent technicians doing their jobs according to standard procedures. Dr. Helen Richardson, the facility's chief medical officer, personally examined Yamamoto. Through the interpreter, the doctor explained that Yamamoto showed signs of chronic malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, and probable tuberculosis exposure. She assured her that she would receive treatment and proper nutrition, and that she was safe. The word felt foreign to Yamamoto, as though it belonged to another world. She had not felt safe since December 7, 1941, when the war began and reshaped all of Japanese society into an extension of military necessity. She had trained as a nurse, believing she was serving a righteous cause, convinced Japan's expansion across Asia represented legitimate national interest, and that America and its allies were colonial oppressors whose defeat would liberate the continent. The propaganda had been sophisticated and pervasive. Historical records preserved in the National Archives and referenced in John Dower's 1986 book, War Without Mercy, note that Japanese military personnel captured late in the war often experienced profound psychological dislocation. When confronted with American material abundance and humane treatment, the stark difference between depictions of barbarous enemies and the reality of American military professionalism produced a form of cognitive dissonance that required significant adjustment. As the women settled into a more predictable routine, receiving regular meals and resting in clean barracks, conversations began flowing more freely. Yamamoto's formal interrogation took place on September 20, 1945, in a small, well-lit room, where American intelligence officer, Major Thomas Bradley, asked questions through a Japanese-American translator named Henry Tanaka. His presence as a person of Japanese descent, serving in the American military, was another unsettling contradiction to the racial ideology she had been taught. Propaganda had claimed that Americans were too racist to trust Japanese-American citizens. Yet here was a Nisei translator working in a sensitive role. Bradley's questions focused on Japanese military medical capabilities, supply chains, and the conditions of field hospitals during the war's final months. Yamamoto answered truthfully, partly because resistance felt pointless and partly because a strange sense of relief had settled in her. The war was over. The defeat was real. The need for deception or sacrifice had evaporated when Bradley asked for her impressions of Japanese military readiness in the months before surrender. She told him they had nothing, no supplies, no medicine, barely any food. She described treating wounded soldiers with boiled cloth because proper bandages had run out, and men dying from infections easily treatable with basic antibiotics. They had known the war was lost, she said, yet had been ordered to fight to the death. Bradley listened without interruption. When he responded, the translator conveyed that American intelligence had estimated casualties from a mainland invasion would have exceeded 10 million. The atomic bombings were terrible, he said, but they ended the war. He expressed sorrow for what she had endured and relief that the fighting was over. The combination of sympathy and pragmatism struck Yamamoto as unusual. A Japanese officer would never have expressed such mixed feelings. Yet the acknowledgement of shared humanity felt strangely honest. It suggested that Americans viewed war not as glorious but as a grim necessity. Weeks later, as autumn deepened in California, the Japanese women were moved to a permanent facility near Stockton. Originally constructed for German and Italian prisoners, the camp was now repurposed for the smaller number of Japanese captives. It gave Yamamoto and her companions more opportunities to observe American society and its industrial capacity. The camp operated smoothly. Electric lighting, running water, flush toilets, steady meal service, recreational areas, even a library with books in Japanese all were standard features. An October 1945 article in the Stockton Record, which Yamamoto would later read after learning English, described the camp as meeting all international standards for humane detention, noting that prisoners received the same food rations as American military personnel. What fascinated her most was the infrastructure sustaining the place. Supply trucks arrived on precise schedules, always fully stocked. The kitchen used industrial appliances that prepared food for hundreds with minimal labor. Maintenance crews fixed problems within hours. The whole operation reflected a level of organization and resource abundance that explained how the United States had fought massive wars in both the Pacific and Europe while maintaining civilian prosperity. As the California landscape turned golden, Yamamoto began taking part in work assignments at the camp. Officers were not required to work under the Geneva Convention, but enlisted prisoners could be assigned tasks for small compensation. She volunteered partly from boredom and partly from growing curiosity about American industry. She was assigned to the camp laundry, where she encountered a level of mechanization that would have seemed like fantasy to most pre-war Japanese. Huge electric washing machines processed hundreds of pounds of clothing a day with just 3 prisoners and 1 American supervisor. Industrial dryers running on natural gas finished the job in minutes. The facility produced clean laundry for the entire camp, with a fraction of the manpower a Japanese laundry would have required. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Eleanor Patterson, treated the prisoners with brisk courtesy and instructed them on the machines as if training any new workers. The washers could handle enormous loads with automatic temperature control and automated soap dispensers. All the prisoners needed to do was load, set cycles, and transfer to dryers. The simplicity was deceptive. The automation revealed a fundamentally different approach to labor. Japanese industry relied on intensive human effort and long hours, while American industry used machines to multiply each worker's productivity. This difference explained much of what Yamamoto had observed. The vast number of ships, aircraft, and ammunition the United States had produced, along with the astonishing consumer abundance. Corporal Sato Fumiko, working beside her, remarked that her father, in Osaka, had once said that Japanese factories studied American methods but could not replicate them because they lacked the machine tools required to build equivalent machines. He had said that American factories built the factories that built the weapons. Only now did the meaning become clear. American industrial strength was not simply a matter of more resources. It was a self-reinforcing system of mechanized production. Factory equipment produced machine tools. Those tools built more advanced factories, which in turn produced consumer goods and military supplies in overwhelming quantities. Japan had tried to compete in this arena without the industrial foundation, like attempting to run a race while building the road in front of oneself. Historians, including Richard Overy in his 1995 book, Why the Allies Won, highlight that Allied victory in World War II stemmed largely from superior industrial capacity. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft, compared to Japan's 28,000, and built more shipping tonnage than all Axis powers combined. These were not just numbers but reflections of divergent industrial systems and technological capabilities. During lunch breaks, the women would gather in a common area and talk freely about how their nation had so profoundly misjudged the balance of power. Yamamoto, well-educated and an officer, often found herself at the center of these discussions. By November 1945, she had settled into a routine at the Stockton facility. Mornings were spent working in the laundry. Afternoons were set aside for English lessons offered to prisoners who wanted to learn. In the evenings, the camp slowly shifted from quiet, shell-shocked silence to conversations that tried to make sense of their situation. The weather had cooled and brought rain, turning the grounds muddy, but never truly uncomfortable, as if even the climate bent toward American convenience. The English classes turned out to be especially eye-opening. Their instructor, Miss Dorothy Chen, was a Chinese-American woman from San Francisco who spoke fluent Japanese and taught with a calm, methodical patience. The textbooks were mass-produced, printed on good paper, clearly illustrated, and neatly organized. Even these basic educational materials reflected abundance. Before the war, Yamamoto had learned bits of English from a single battered textbook shared among several students. Here, every prisoner received her own book, along with paper, pencils, and workbooks. Miss Chen explained that English was an efficient language that borrowed freely from Latin, French, German, and Greek, and that Americans tended to be practical people who used whatever worked without worrying about where it came from. This flexibility, she suggested, made American culture adaptable. To Yamamoto. The observation applied far beyond language. She had noticed that American systems were built around practical functionality, rather than aesthetic purity or strict adherence to ideology. If something worked, Americans used it. If it didn't, they changed it. It was a striking contrast to Japanese tradition, hierarchy, and formal correctness. One afternoon, Major Bradley visited the class with an unusual proposal. The War Department wanted to interview Japanese prisoners to better understand their perspectives on the war, military culture, and civilian life. The interviews would be voluntary and compensated with small payments added to their accounts. Curious, Yamamoto agreed immediately. The sessions began in mid-November and quickly became some of her most revealing encounters with American thinking. Her interviewer was Dr. Ruth Benedict, an anthropologist working for the Office of War Information. Rather than focusing on military matters, Benedict asked about social structures, family expectations, education, and cultural values. She sought to understand Japanese behavior within its own cultural logic, not to judge or dismiss it. During their first meeting, Benedict asked Yamamoto to talk about her family. Encouraged by Benedict's.com, interested tone, Yamamoto found herself speaking at length about growing up in her father's work as a mid-level bureaucrat, her mother's devotion to the household, and the expectations that had shaped her education and career. She described the obligations children owed their parents, the responsibilities of older siblings, and the careful observance of social hierarchy that guided every interaction. Benedict listened closely, occasionally asking for clarification, but never reacting with shock or criticism. Even when Yamamoto mentioned customs she assumed Americans might find strange or restrictive. As winter settled over California in December, Yamamoto received a letter that reshaped her understanding of conditions back home. Mail service had been established, allowing correspondence with families in occupied Japan, though delays and censorship were unavoidable. The letter from her younger sister, Sachiko, had taken 6 weeks to reach her. The envelope was marked with numerous stamps showing its long journey from Yokohama. Written on rough paper in neat handwriting. The letter painted a picture of devastation that was both expected and painful to read. Sachiko opened with formal language, assuring her sister that the family had survived despite severe changes. Their house had been destroyed in the May fire bombings, but she and their mother had been staying with relatives at the time. Their father's office had also been destroyed, leaving him unemployed like many former civil servants. Food rationing was severe. Most civilians lived on reduced rice portions, supplemented by whatever they could find or trade. The black market dominated daily life, and American cigarettes had become more stable currency than the rapidly inflating yen. Occupation forces controlled most government functions. They were not especially cruel, Sachiko wrote, but their presence was a constant reminder of defeat. Her neighborhood had been fortunate, with no cases of assault or abuse, though rumors from other places were troubling. Sachiko wrote that they had feared Yamamoto dead until a Red Cross representative assured them she was alive and held in the United States. Their mother had cried with relief. They had been told that Americans tortured and executed prisoners, but the Red Cross insisted that prisoners were being treated according to international law. Is this true? Are you being fed properly? Please write and tell us. We worry constantly. That evening, Yamamoto sat down to compose her reply. She thought carefully about what to share and what to soften, knowing that both American and Japanese authorities might read it. She chose honesty. She described her journey to California, the shock of seeing American abundance, the humane treatment at the camp, the adequate food and medical care, and the work and educational opportunities available to prisoners. She avoided political commentary and stated only what she had witnessed. The way a nurse or prisoner might record clinical details, she wrote that the propaganda they had received during the war had been deeply inaccurate, choosing each word with care. America's industrial capacity was far greater than they had been led to believe. Its cities were intact, its people lived in visible prosperity, and its military functioned with organizational efficiency and abundant resources. That, she explained, was why the Americans had won so decisively. She emphasized that she did not write this to cause her family pain, but because they deserved to understand the truth behind the outcome. Asterisk, as Christmas approached, the camp administration arranged an unexpected event, a holiday celebration with music, special food, and small gifts. The very idea felt strange, prisoners being invited to observe the captors' holiday. But the execution was even more surprising. The mess hall was adorned with paper snowflakes, strings of colored lights, and a large Christmas tree decorated by American soldiers. The tables were set with better plates and silverware than usual. The Christmas of 1945 at the Stockton facility became one of the most vivid memories Yamamoto carried for decades. The camp chaplain, Captain Robert Green, opened the event with a short explanation of Christmas traditions, translated into Japanese by Henry Tanaka. He spoke of peace, goodwill, and hope for reconciliation. These could have sounded bitterly ironic under the circumstances, but his sincerity softened the message and prompted contemplation rather than anger. The meal surpassed anything the prisoners had experienced at the camp: roasted turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, green beans, cranberry sauce, bread rolls with butter, and pumpkin pie. For women who had ended the war, eating rice mixed with sawdust and scavenged vegetables, the abundance felt overwhelming. Some cried quietly, caught between gratitude, shame, grief, and a confusing sense of relief. After the meal, a group of American soldiers sang Christmas carols, including several songs translated into Japanese. Hearing Americans sing in her own language, even clumsily, affected Yamamoto in a way she had tried to shield herself against. These men, former enemies, had taken time to learn songs in Japanese as an act of respect and shared humanity. The gesture revealed something distinctly different in American attitudes compared to the strict ideological framework she had known in Japan. Major Bradley spoke briefly afterward. Through the translator, he said the war was over, that terrible acts had occurred on both sides, but that it was finished. The prisoners were still prisoners, yes, but they were also human beings deserving dignity. That was an American conviction, he explained. Even enemies remained human. He wished them a peaceful future and a Merry Christmas. Yamamoto was struck by the blunt, unadorned manner of his words. Japanese officials would have delivered a similar message wrapped in formal rhetoric and ideological framing, but the directness here felt genuine. She began to understand that neither cultural style was superior. Each grew from its own history and priorities. Days later, she received a letter from a former colleague, Nurse Corporal Watanabe Yuki, who had been captured in Okinawa and held in Arizona. Yuki described similar shock at American abundance, humane treatment, and the mental struggle created by encountering a reality that contradicted everything they had been told. She wrote that she had been reading American newspapers in the camp library and noticed how many advertisements promoted consumer goods: cars, refrigerators, washing machines, clothing, entertainment. Each ad included prices, and she realized that a factory worker on minimum wage could afford many of those items within weeks or months. A comparable Japanese worker would have needed years to purchase anything similar, assuming it could be purchased at all. She noted that America's industrial strength seemed rooted in its ability to produce goods ordinary people could afford, stimulating demand, justifying mass production, lowering costs further, and expanding access. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of economic growth. Yamamoto recognized the accuracy of this insight. As winter turned to spring in 1946, more information began to reach the prisoners about conditions in post-war Japan and plans for eventual repatriation. Recovery was underway under American occupation, though slowly, and the damage from the war would shape Japan for many years. MacArthur's administration was implementing sweeping reforms, including land redistribution, women's suffrage, educational restructuring, and democratization of government. These changes sounded both hopeful and unsettling to those who had grown up within the traditional system. Repatriation would occur in stages, with civilians and sick prisoners sent first. As a healthy military prisoner, Yamamoto anticipated remaining in the United States for at least another year. To her own surprise, she felt conflicted about returning. She longed desperately for her family, yet her time in America had transformed her worldview in ways she feared would make challenging. Dr. Benedict conducted a final interview with her in March 1946. They revisited themes they had explored over the past months. Benedict eventually asked what Yamamoto expected to tell people in Japan about America. After a moment of reflection, Yamamoto said she would explain that they had been wrong about many things. They had been taught that Americans were soft, lacking courage, weakened by comfort, unable to endure a long war, divided by racial and class tensions, and handicapped by inferior industry. None of it was true. Americans were practical, problem-solving, and capable of organizing immense collective effort. Their industry was far more advanced than Japan's had been. They had underestimated not American spirit, but American capacity. She also said she would tell people a more difficult truth. Japan had lost the war before it began, not because its soldiers lacked bravery or its leaders lacked devotion, but because the country misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They believed spirit could overcome material disadvantage, and they had been wrong. It was a painful lesson, she said, but essential if Japan hoped to avoid future catastrophe. Benedict asked whether she thought people in Japan were ready to hear this. Yamamoto answered honestly that they were not, but they needed to hear it anyway. On August 15, 1946, exactly 1 year after the Emperor's surrender announcement, Lieutenant Yamamoto Ko boarded a transport ship in San Francisco for her return to Japan. She watched the Golden Gate Bridge shrink into the distance, the same bridge whose scale had stunned her when she first arrived 13 months earlier. She was going home to a country she barely recognized from the letters she had received, carrying knowledge that had reshaped her understanding of Japan's past and its potential future. Decades later, in 1968, she would publish a memoir titled Prisoner of Abundance, recounting her experiences as a prisoner in the United States and the profound shift in perspective that resulted.